I'm reading the biography for Walter Lippmann. It's called Walter Lippmann and the American Century by Ronald Steele. Chapter 5, A Little Iconoclasm. Lippmann was eager to write a book, but was not quite sure how to get at what he wanted to say. He had read a lot about politics, and most of it had left him dissatisfied. The year with Stephens had shattered his faith in reformers, and the experience in Schenectady had soured him on socialism. He knew that something was wrong with the way people had been taught to think about politics. Wallace had made him realize how futile it was to squeeze human beings into intellectual molds, to base laws on abstract notions of right and wrong rather than on how people actually thought and behaved. His mentor seemed to him on the right track in emphasizing the irrational elements of political behavior rather than parliaments and constitutions. Quote, I have been writing what may be a small book, at least a series of essays, end quote. He wrote Wallace in July. Quote, and no small part of it is aimed at popularizing your human nature in politics, end quote. As Lippmann put together his essays, laying out what he had learned in his work with Stephens and the socialists, he talked over his ideas with his cabin mate. Alfred Kuttner was an agreeable companion, bookish, complacent, and with a keen mind. Although he had little interest in politics, preferring to write poetry and literary criticism, he had some interesting insights. Kuttner had been forced to drop out of college several times as a result of a mental depression. When traditional doctors proved unable to help, he put himself in the hands of A. Briel, a disciple of Freudian psychoanalysis, then just beginning to be known in the United States. Fascinated by the new discipline, with its unfamiliar terms of libido, superego, and repression, Kuttner read everything he could by Freud. Since virtually nothing had been translated into English, Kuttner set out, under Briel's guidance, to translate the master's classic interpretation of dreams. Thus, it was that in a cabin in the backwoods of Maine in the summer of 1912, Kuttner was putting into English theories that would transform the way people thought about their unconscious. While a few feet away, Lippmann was trying to figure out why politics so often seemed contrary to human behavior and needs. Around the fair at night, as Kuttner explained what Freud meant by words like taboo and sublimation, Lippmann glimpsed a new analytical tool. Since politics was a system of social interaction, it had to be governed by the same forces that governed other social behavior. The link seemed obvious, but no one had ever made the connection. Freud offered liberation not only from the prison of Herbert Spencer's social Darwinism, but also from a progressivism that saw man climbing ever upward to perfection. Freud's analysis of the unconscious showed why reason alone could not explain human behavior, and at the same time suggested how emotions could be channeled by reason. This is what Wallace had glimpsed but not quite grasped. Quote, "Are you in your new book making much use of the Freudian psychology?" End quote, Lippmann wrote Wallace. "I have been studying it with a great deal of enthusiasm for several months now, and I feel about it as man might have felt about the origin of a species. I went back and read some of James with a curious sense that the world must have been very young in the 1880s. End quote. Lippmann could hardly contain his enthusiasm. The dream inspiration, the book on wheat, the aesthetics, the child psychology, do for the first time in any psychology I know furnish a picture of human nature in the act, so to speak, of creating and expressing the character. Its political applications have hardly begun, though there are a few stray articles here and there." End quote. Freud was just what Lippmann needed to give his book a novel twist. Excitedly, he raced through the chapters, injecting Freudian terms into his discussion of politics. He returned to New York at the end of the summer with a completed manuscript in hand. One of the first people he looked up was Lincoln Stephens, back from his wanderings in Europe after the death of his invalid wife, and now living in the same Washington Square rooming house as his protege John Reed. Quote, "Lippmann dined with me last night, and he is in a bully state of mind," Stephens reported to a friend. He had good reason to be. Michel Kenderly had snapped up the book and was planning to serialize parts of it in 3 successive issues of his magazine, The Forum. Not bad for a man just turned 23. Going over the revised page proves that fall, Kuttner wrote Lippmann of his excitement at finding it intellectually so wide open. Although he had heard Lippmann sketch out the argument of the book, he was delighted at the daring of the phrasing and the inexorable flow of the logic. He said, "I keep thinking of the types of men that will collide with it, and their utter bewilderment, their anxiety to follow you in one point and feel themselves clear of it, only to be caught up by their unconscious prejudice even as they complacently turn a page." End quote. The book came out in the spring of 1913 to the sort of reviews that turn author's head. Quote, "The ablest brief book of its kind published during the last 10 years." End quote. Quote, "The quality of a fine mind cutting sharply under its problem and fertilizing it to new issues. One of the most energetic, resourceful iconoclasts who ever turned to browse in the field of American politics." End quote. One reviewer even went so far as to predict that a few years hence academic discussions in political economy may be very generally punctuated with the explanatory clause, as Lippmann says. Sparely, even elegantly written, the book was an intellectual potpourri, stuffed with nearly everything Lippmann had learned at college and after, beginning with John Dewey's Blueprint for Social Change and Herbert Croly's New Nationalism. He had added James' celebration of experience, Bergson's intuition, Nietzsche's affirmation of the will, Well's scientific utopianism, and of course, a heavy dose of Freud. He had written not a systematic theory, but as he called it, a preface to politics. It was a young man's book that raised more questions than it explored, and showed Lippmann's receptivity to new ideas rather than any coherent philosophy. Later, he half-mockingly said it covered pretty nearly all human problems. But for all its thinness, it was taut, perceptive, and iconoclastic. Copy had taught him to hone down his prose to lean, graceful sentences, and Stephens had drilled into him the need to stick to the facts. In 9 gracefully turned short chapters, Lippmann assaulted virtually the entire catalog of traditional progressivism, electoral reform, the two-party system, muckraking, trust-busting, free competition, corruptions flourished because the laws failed to take human nature into account. Political machines existed because they provided a service to the voters needed. Tammany, he declared, in words that shocked a good many progressives, has a better perception of a human need, and comes nearer to being what a government should be, than any scheme yet proposed by a group of uptown good government reformers. Where traditionalists on the left extorted the wisdom of the people, Lippmann questioned the tyranny of popular majorities and called for the scientific expertise of a class of managers. No more judgment can declare the value of life, he proclaimed in an echo for William James. No ethical theory can announce any intrinsic good. Creeds were to be distrusted. Tradition is nothing but a record and a machine-made imitation of the habits that our ancestors created. End quote. Heady stuff indeed. A preface to politics exalted the faith of the young radicals in scientific management, their openness to emotion and experience, their admiration of leadership, their rejection of a 19th century morality, and their contempt for the cautious reformism of the small-town progressive. Lippmann managed to capture the energies of an era just discovering Cubism and symbolism, psychoanalysis and syndicalism. He became a spokesman for a generation that found not only pleasure but a moral imperative in denying the wisdom of its elders. The book's originality, however, lay not in its undergraduate idol smashing, but in its application to politics of Freud's theory of personality. Instead of trying to crush badness, we must turn the power behind it to good account, Lippmann wrote in an attack on laws against prostitution and adultery. Detaching such concepts as taboo, repression, and sublimation from their strict Freudian context, he gave them a new interpretation and made them the key to his theory of politics. Instead of tabooing our impulses, we must direct them. People had to be provided with civilizing opportunities for satisfying their needs and desires. Most laws, like those against drinking or sex, tried to prohibit and punish human drives rather than redirect them toward better goals. Sublimation provided the key for supplying our passions with civilized interests. Lippmann's novel interpretation of Freud's concepts soon reached Vienna. The master's British disciple, Ernst Jones, reviewed the book in the Freudian journal Imago and declared that while books about politics have, as a rule, little claim to the attention of the psychoanalyst, Lippmann's could be recommended most heartily as an impressive attempt to apply modern psychological knowledge and insight to the problems of sociology and political science. What interested Lippmann was not so much Freud's methods of psychiatric treatment as the liberating effect of the theory of the unconscious on social thought. Quote, "When I compared his book with the psychology that I studied in college, or with most of the material that is used to controvert him," end quote, he wrote of Freud in 1915, quote, "I cannot help feeling that for his illumination, for his steadiness and brilliancy of mind, he may rank among the greatest who have contributed to thought," end quote. A few years later, in Vienna, Lippmann actually met Freud, who invited him to a meeting of the Psychoanalytic Society and introduced him to Adler and Jung. Lippmann used Freud's work imaginatively, though not as wisely as he might have done had the ideas been more familiar. His prescription for sublimating the evils of giant trusts by channeling them to social uses was fanciful, as he later recognized. Also, in emphasizing the role of unconscious, he came close to extolling irrationalism for his own sake. Graham Wallace, somewhat upset by Lippmann's foray into the irrational, mildly chided his former student. Lippmann took the lesson to heart, and by 1914 had dropped Nietzsche and Bergson by the wayside. He also discarded any lingering sentimentality about socialism. While urging justice for the voiceless multitudes who have been left to pass unnoticed, he now castigated many of his fellow socialists as interested pedants of destiny, and saw in centralized government the germs of that great bureaucratic tyranny which Charleston and Belloc have named the servile state. Rejecting the Marxist analysis of capitalism, he was left with an approach to socialism as expedient as it was eclectic. We shall feel free to choose among alternatives, to take this much socialism, insert so much syndicalism, leaving standing what of capitalism seems worth conserving. End quote. This was not socialism. It was a fruit salad. Small wonder that Lippmann was criticized by socialist militants, or that within 2 years he would leave the party altogether. Rather than being a socialist tract, a preface to politics was a hymn to Boo Moore's progressivism, phrased in the language of Greenwich Village radicalism. It had been written during the very summer that Theodore Roosevelt, having been denied renomination by the Republicans, had formed his own renegade Bull Moose party. Lippmann trooped to the colors, proclaiming TR the working model for an ideal American statesman, just as TR's challenge to the prevailing economic order was one of a style more than of a substance. So Lippmann's book was less an attack on an inequitable social system than an assault on the arbiters of a dying Victorian culture. As such, it was a perfect expression of the revolt against what Santayana had contemptuously called the genteel tradition. Appearing in the spring of 1913, it coincided with a flood of cultural experimentation. To young radicals like Lippmann, the world was waiting to be reborn, and a beneficent providence had put the tools in their hands. Quote, "The fiddles are tuning up all over America," end quote, wrote the young critic Van Wyck Brooks. Restless men and women flocked to the narrow streets of Greenwich Village to express themselves and seek out kindred souls. Their political journal was The Masses, which, under the free-wheeling direction of Max Eastman and John Reed, playfully declared it would do as it pleases and reconcile and conciliate nobody, not even its readers. Their theater was the Provincetown Playhouse, which had just moved to New York from Cape Cod, to put on experimental plays by the unknown Eugene O'Neill. Their art gallery was Alfred Stieglitz's 291 Fifth Avenue, where Matisse and Cézanne had their first American showings, where young native experimentalists like Marston Hartley and Georgia O'Keeffe exhibited, and where photography became an instrument of art. Their restaurant was a Polish on McDonald Street, where over spaghetti and cheap wine they could argue all night about psychoanalysis and socialism. It seems as though everywhere in that year of 1913, barriers went down and people reached each other who had never been in touch before, remembered Marble Dutch, hostage to the Cultural Revolution. There were all sorts of new ways to communicate, as well as new communications. Everything seemed possible. The only enemies were tradition and timidity. Okay, let me just stop here. We'll read next time.